Everything's pre-flat, so it's called the title.
Thank you.
This just makes it easier for you.
Yep.
I've done this rodeo.
She's been all over the world, but never been to Oregon. No. I mean, I don't know how far you're planning to ride. We're not. Obviously, I'm not a biker, so just fool around. Oh, yeah. Did a few miles, per day, sort of thing. You can step up. I did it December. I was out on my March, April. Yeah. No, I didn't.
Is the projector in your eyes? I'll move that over. Yeah, you can slide over.
Oh, say you were high school student. No, the pressure's gone. Oh. No, I go for it. Yeah, we're Iowa. All from Iowa. We didn't know each other till we they lived down the street from us, and Dave, her husband, lived across the street from me in Iowa. So everybody in Iowa State is.
But he wasn't a team.
That's what Greg was.
That's what's I know
Greg was a team because he joined that one because we were across the street from where I live, and it was cheaper.
well, I'm nicer. Well, probably.
It was just cheaper. How much it was cheaper for him because he got to work there.
He's one of 10 kids. Well, the storm didn't have to help with planting. That's what we get. Oh, is that where I live? Yeah, there. I was there. We met once, but I think he may have one. Iowa on the side. I was in board there.
No, it was not. I was working.
I didn't know.
Which I thought was another something else.
It was flat.
It was not I was important. But I had to laugh because when we go out to play, our family would all be out. It's Murray Day, so go outside and play. We were the only kids outside. We didn't care. But when we moved to Iowa from Green Bay, there was a
You got new shoes?
no, these are my pickleball shoes.
Skechers.
I have a couple. I got like 3 pairs of Skechers. Which is out the middle way, and Summer Garden Park has some courts and some that were just
We'll give it a couple minutes.
But you really can't read it. No, I don't. How are your raspberries?
So you have a lot of actually.
Well, I call it new baby. I don't know if she's about a year old. You know what? You know how big mine are? Like, never make them up. That's really good this year. I'm not gonna try.
All right, I think we'll get started now, or at least I'll get started with my introductory remarks. Don't worry, I don't have a microphone, but our guests tonight do. I usually talk loud enough where I don't need one, but you can be the judge of that. My name is Jim Ramsey. I am the head of adult services here at the Middleton Public Library. So that means I'm in charge of all of the events, be they lectures, discussions, workshops, classes, etc. For adults here at the library. And I first of all want to say thank you to everyone for coming out. I realize that there's a lot of competition for your attention, especially in the summer. Although the weather tonight, we weren't really sure if it was going to cooperate. Sometimes the nice weather hurts you because people want to be out doing other things, but if it's, of course, too severe, that's not good either. But the sun was out last I looked briefly. So again, thank you for coming out and for spending the evening here at the library. So the next thing that I say is something that I say at all of these events, and if you come to a lot of these, you'll just have to bear with me for the next 20 seconds or so. The Friends of the Middleton Public Library. The Friends of the Middleton Public Library are the nonprofit group that support all of the events here at the Middleton Public Library. So many people don't know that. The Friends fund all of the programming here at the library, for programs for little kids all the way on up to adults. Another thing that not many people know is that anybody can be a friend of the Middleton Public Library. I'm here to tell you, any of you here tonight can be a friend. There's information on how to do that on a brochure on the table on the way out. The Friends raise money primarily through their book sales, but also through subscribing membership. So if you love the Middleton Public Library and you enjoy the events that we have here, consider becoming a subscribing member to the Friends. Speaking of the table on the way out, we have a few flyers there, some upcoming events. I program a little bit lighter during the summer because I know a lot of people are on vacation, out of town, but even so, we still have a couple big events coming up next month. On July 11th, we have journalist Edward McClellan. He was here last year talking about his book, How to Speak Midwestern, and he will be back this time with a folk singer in tow to talk about his book, Folk Songs and Legends of the Middle West. So that's on July 11th. And then on the 25th, also a Wednesday, we have the next lecture in the series that we call Scholared for Life. I'm sure many of you have been to the lectures in this series. So we have Richard Davidson gave the last lecture in this series at Fromry Middle School in May. The next lecture is Professor of Philosophy, Larry Shapiro. And in fact, this event This event tonight came about, the opportunity to have this event came about, relatively speaking, rather suddenly, thanks to our friends at Mystery to Me bookstore. But had I planned it further in advance, this event tonight almost certainly would have been included in this Scholar for Life series. This is a series where we invite professors in to either talk about their recent research or share a favorite lecture. So I hope you'll pick up one of those flyers on your way out, and we hope to see you at an event in the future. So we have two guests tonight. Our first guest this evening probably needs no introduction, but he is a lifelong Madisonian and graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, called the Inimitable Chronicler of Madison by Pulitzer Prize-winning author David Moranis. He has worked as a journalist and author for almost 40 years, and as a daily newspaper columnist for the Cap Times and the Wisconsin State Journal. He's written over 4,000 columns. Prior to his newspaper career, he was editor of Madison Magazine, where he won numerous awards for his writing, including being voted best local writer or columnist more than a dozen times. His books include The World of Mike Royko, about the famous Chicago newspaper columnist, and Lords of the Ring, Triumph and Tragedy of College Boxing's Greatest Team. He's currently collaborating with former Governor Tommy Thompson on Thompson's autobiography. Please join me in welcoming Doug Moe. This is Doug. Our second guest this evening is a professor at UW-Madison's Robert M. La Follette School of Public Affairs, with appointments in sociology, applied economics, and population health sciences. His specialties include health economics, the economics of education, child and adolescent health policy. He earned a bachelor's in economics and public administration from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and his master's and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. From 2010 to 2012, he was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar at Columbia University. And in 2012, he was selected for a Career Development Award by the William T. Grant Foundation. His recent articles have appeared in the Review of Economics and Statistics, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management, to name a few. His most recent book, The Genome Factor, which he will, of course, be discussing tonight, was co-authored with Princeton sociologist Dalton Conley and published last year. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jason Fletcher. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, thanks, folks. I'll tell you quickly how things will work here this evening. Jason and I will chat for 30 or 40 minutes or so, and at that time we'll open up to audience questions. And I have a feeling this subject and this book we'll have some questions, so think of some good ones. I also want to thank Middleton Library for providing the venue and also for all those services and programs that Jim talked about. And a quick plug for Mystery to Me. I'm in Rose Street, where I've been doing author events now for about 3 years. And really enjoying doing it. If you haven't been to the store, over half the books are non-mystery, although it's a great mystery selection. It's just, I'm a little biased, but it's a wonderful place, and thanks so much for supporting independent bookstores. Jason, I was going to ask you a little about your background, but Jim kind of hit a lot of it. But I do want to ask where you're from originally. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in a small town in Tennessee, about an hour south of Knoxville, and then I went to the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, for my bachelor's degree, and then came here for 5 years for master's and PhD. So small town is 2,000 or fewer people.
Anything in particular make Madison where you wanted to come for grad school?
My wife loves the story, which is that I was going to economics PhD, so I looked at the top 15 or so schools, and I was going to apply to all 15, and I skipped over Madison first because it was too cold, and my wife said, no, definitely apply there, and I did, and this is where I ended up going, and I loved it, and we went to Connecticut after graduating here in '06, and always had an eye towards could we ever come back. And 5 years ago, we're very happy to be able to come back and probably stay forever.
Early on, in the book, you mentioned that the themes of the book came out of, at least in part, a conference that you've been attending, I think, almost for a decade now, out in Colorado, of integrating genetics into the social system. And you mentioned that one of your first interactions with your co-author had to do with him taking you to task or dismantling the paper that you wrote at the first conference.
That's right.
Is that true?
That's right. So I'm an economist by training, and Dalton's a sociologist, and our first interaction was much worse than most subsequent interactions, which is to say he has been a pioneer in this field of integrating genetics and social science. So his first PhD is in sociology, but he went back to get a second PhD in biology while he was the dean at NYU. And so he's a very productive and exciting person. And one of my first interactions with him is what Doug said and what we describe in the book very briefly, because I didn't want to get into the gory details, which is to say I had an idea, this is one way of integrating genetics with economics, and proceeded to present in front of 50 or so people at this conference, and then he was the discussant, meaning that he had read the paper and he was going to come up and provide insightful commentary. And his insightful commentary is mostly like, you should never do anything of what you just did. There's another path forward, and so on. So that was, but it was a productive meeting, and like I said, he was at NYU until recently when he moved to Princeton. But during the time he was at NYU, part of that time I was at Columbia University in the city of New York. So that was 2 years of time that we really, I think, outlined both things the book is trying to do, which is to look backwards about 8 years or 10 years to where the initial foray into integrating genetics and social science happened. And this is a very young field. There's the original human DNA sequence was only done in the early 2000s, 2003 or so. So it can't be so long before now that there was a large integration of social science and genetics. But during that time in New York City, when we were both there at different universities, I think that's where, after I licked my wounds and decided to still talk to someone who said very bad things about my research, we decided to take our disciplinary differences and use them as complements in thinking about how genetics is integrating in economics and in sociology and in political science, for that matter. And that's really the basis of the book.
It's probably helpful to go back before that, 10 years ago. As a kid in school, I seem to remember nature and nurture being two vastly different camps. You were either one or the other. Social scientists and geneticists didn't get along at all, for the most part. Is that right?
That's my understanding too. And I think that's a common. And I'd say most people here, at least, are very comfortable with the idea that there's certain conditions, medical conditions, that we think of as maybe pure nature or pure genetic, and maybe think about how our children grow up and how much of this, of their differences when you have more than one child in particular, or maybe even if you have identical twins, their differences being partly nurture, rather than nature. So that, it's a long history, hundreds of years or more, that we document a little bit about this in the book. And one cleavage you can think about in why nature versus nurture is so important in the social versus biological sciences, probably from about 100 years ago, when there was a very robust eugenics movement in the United States and around many developed countries. And Dalton, who, like I said, is a sociologist, really thinks of sociology as being, in part, a reaction against genetic determinism and biological determinism, and in some ways that there was a parting of science maybe 100 years ago or less during this time, and it's only been recently that there's, that's maybe oversimplifying it by a lot, but we are describing the recent convergence back into both using nature and nurture, and thinking about them not as separate and not in competition, but really how they interplay with one another as being what most traits and most outcomes are determined by, not both separately acting in two different lanes, but in overlapping and interacting with one another as being how we might progress more in science. is to taking both nature and nurture into account and their interplay.
In the introductory chapter, when you talk about this exciting revolution, if you will, you also put in a cautionary note saying it is very young and there is some like heritability. How much of that can you trust or that it's so new that I think you're wise to be cautious.
It is new, and I think we should be cautious because this has happened before. It seems like each time this has happened, where there's been a lot of integration between biological sciences and genetics in particular, and public policy or social policy, there's just been terrible consequences. You can think of eugenics as
eugenics, Jason.
So eugenics has a reasonable history in one sense, which is to say, when farmers look out at their crops and they think about putting their thumb on the scale of what genetic traits they want to incorporate in the next generation, which is to cross-fertilize certain crops, certain ears of corn or whatever you'd like, certain cows, to get the next generation with traits that the farmer would care about. You can see where you could just take that idea of the purposeful breeding of individual cows or individual crops to better that species, and then you can see where this would turn around and say, well, why not do it in humans? Say that there are traits that are better than others. Maybe IQ would have been the one that was dates back to many hundreds of years ago as a trait that eugenicists think of as what we'd like to cultivate the next generation. And then again you take your crop version of this and apply it to humans, and that's where you would sterilize humans that have traits that the population doesn't like, and that's exactly what happened in the United States and other places. Wisconsin had sterilization laws. There were thousands of people sterilized. I think the laws only went off the books in the 1970s, if I'm recalling, in Wisconsin. So you can see where the theory, the science, comes from, which is what you would do in livestock or plants. We do the same thing in humans. For the better of the species. But then, of course, we all know as you take that to the extreme, and a relatively recent version of this is the Holocaust. So we don't. So that's always hanging over, I think, the heads of people who are thinking about doing this integration. When I was first started thinking about doing this book, I had a lot of very reasonable and cautious discussions with advisors and people from the William T. Grant Foundation who were supporting my career development, and other foundations saying, very careful. It is a fine line, especially because the book describes some of the chapters are about what does genetics tell us about what we think of race, and what about genetics of differences across countries and whether they're rich or poor. There's integration of genetics with macroeconomics. These are all very both exciting but potentially quite dangerous, and not wanting to repeat what's happened in seems like every other time, which is terrible, terrible outcomes. So we want to be as cautious as we can, but then also realize, and this is part of the point of maybe the end part of the book, which is bringing us up to date now, which is that we have millions and millions of people contributing genetic information to companies like 23andMe, AncestryDNA.com, and how is that information going to be used? And that's maybe what we'll talk about for a big chunk of time here. That's what I think other audiences I've been to are particularly interested in. So I don't want to fast forward too fast, but that's one place that I think we'll go.
As a corollary to the dangers of it, though, you guys make the point that if you're careful and you study it, you can end up kind of exploding some stereotypes. I think just quick about, you mentioned race, you mentioned there's a phone app, an iPhone app that says, don't sleep with your sister, she might be your cousin. Something like that.
It's close to that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to clean that up a little bit. But then you make the point, the typical marriage in the United States is between people who are the genetic equivalent of second cousins.
just a fascinating finding in the literature is so I described 23andMe as one avenue where people are contributing their DNA. Another avenue is social surveys. There are many large social surveys. There happens to be a large social survey in the United States of spouses who each of the spouses have contributed their DNA. And in doing so, social scientists can examine questions that geneticists wouldn't necessarily care about, which is to ask, you take 10,000 spouses in the United States and you ask them how genetically similar is a typical spousal pair in the United States. Because on one hand, you might think they're very genetically similar in the sense that spouses among anybody that you know are the most similar to you in terms of education and IQ and political preference and attractiveness and so on. Almost any measure, there's high correlation among spouses, and most of the measures I just described have at least a partial genetic basis. So you think if you add A plus B, you would get some similarity genetically in spouses, even though they're not actually family tree genetically the same. They're not, because we have the second aspect where you think that spousal genetics would be very different, would be the extreme social prohibitions we have in this country about not marrying your cousins and not marrying your sisters or your siblings, because that, of course, would make spouses very similar. So it turns out when you have one direction saying don't marry your actual cousins and your actual sisters, which is not true in other countries, don't marry your actual family, but also we have it turns out we have the regularity that people marry people like themselves in many, many dimensions. So those two pathways in some sense average out to the finding, which is that you and your spouse are approximately second cousins, but not in the family tree second cousins, but you're similar like as if you were second cousins, but without that family tree designation. So that's a finding that is new, and you could never know that until the last few years, where you've had tens of thousands of people contributing their DNA, and some of those tens of thousands of people being spouses.
Can we talk a little about heritability? And I was interested in how difficult it can actually be to track that. So many genes and so.
So there's a lot I could say there. So let me try to start by saying that heritability dates back as a concept. So heritability is meant to describe the proportion of an outcome, say height, to be a good example, that is genetically based versus environmentally based. So you think of that as a nature versus nurture question. So what proportion? It's somewhere between 0 and 100% of height is genetic, or of weight is genetic, or of eye color is genetic, and so on. You can think of many traits. So before there was human DNA sequenced, this has been a question on scientists and geneticists' minds for decades, if not centuries. So the old way of doing this, asking this question, was to examine how similar identical twins are in their heights and in their weights and in their educational attainments and in their IQ, and compare that to, the reason you start with identical twins is that all their DNA is the same. And you compare that to fraternal twins, to non-identical twins, and fraternal twins are just like siblings, except they were born the same time. They share 50% of their common DNA versus 100% of monozygotic or identical twins. So when you make that type of contrast, you're asking, are identical twins more similar than fraternal twins? And to the extent that they're more similar, you're going to adjudicate genetics as the source. Because otherwise, they're all siblings. The way that identical twins are different is because they have the same genetics versus having half the same genetics. So that's the old way. So you would enroll thousands of twins, identical and fraternal, and examine whether height seems to be more similar in identical, and it is, than fraternal. And you'd examine whether autism is more similar in identical and fraternal, and it is. And to the extent that they're more similar, you're moving closer to 100% heritability, or heritable, which is more genetic, versus 0%. So years of schooling, how far you go in school, is about 30 to 40% heritable. Height is in the 80s to 90s. Many, schizophrenia is in the 80s to 90s. Many neurological disorders are in the 80s to 90s. Myopia, having different eye disorders are in the high 80s to 90s. Meaning, but high 80s to 90 means that when you look at identical twins versus fraternal twins, you see that identical twins are more similar, and you attribute that similarity to genetics. So that's heritability, and that was all before DNA, measured DNA. Now there's measured DNA. So there's been a whole industry of asking not just 0% versus 50% versus 100% genetic or heritable. Where in the genome are there areas where your DNA seems to matter for the outcome? And the clear, unexpected answer is that for almost everything, there's no gene for that outcome. There's no gene for height. There's no gene for education. There's no gene for IQ. For almost everything, it is small differences across the whole genome that seem to add up to produce height, to produce IQ. There's a couple counterexamples. So, sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell is a single nucleotide or base pair difference in your DNA. So you could have identical DNA across 3 billion base pairs, which is what each of your cells have, and there could be one difference between you and someone next to you, and that one difference across the 3 billion potential differences would decide whether you have sickle cell or not. So there's a couple places in your DNA that really matter. But that's the exception. And you could think of exceptions as genetic disorders, Huntington's disease. Those are the exceptions. Almost everything else, your height, your weight, your IQ, your education, your cardiovascular risk, everything else seems to follow small effects across the 3 billion nucleotides or the 3 billion letter pairs in your genome. And so the last 10 years, the last 15 years has been a hunt for where. I mean, on one hand, you think that height is 80 to 90% heritable. Where? We want to go through, geneticists want to go through and look, what about here? What about here? What about here? And you do that 3 billion times. What about here? What about here? What about here? What about here? And eventually, you want to be able to account for what the twin studies are showing. So and this is going to, I think, transition maybe into what this type of analysis is doing and used for. So the what about here, what about here, what about here analysis, when you do that millions or tens of millions of times, how that now is, I think, of interest to us is, let me show you. Let me give a couple. Let me see if the visual is actually going to be better here. So you can see I have a lot of backup slides because I've given this presentation before. Okay, so what I was getting at was what's called the jargon. The what about here, what about here, what about here, what about here analysis is called genome-wide association study. Genome-wide meaning we'll look everywhere in the genome where there's a difference across people and ask, what about here, what about here, what about here? So you can see some ways of visualizing this. You could have visualized it based on your chromosomes. We're going to line them all up, and at every point in every chromosome, if there's a possible difference between humans, we'll say, what about here? Okay. And I'll back up and say, just so that we recall, maybe our high school biology or genetics, that there are 3 billion places, add up all the chromosomes, that there could be a difference. On one hand, that's a lot. But humans are very similar to one another genetically. 99.5+% of every one of those 3 billion potential differences is identical in every human who's ever lived, whoever will live. So there's only less than 1% of all those potential places where there is difference between in one human versus another. So there's a lot of commonality across all our differences. And And before we take that too far, though, is that I did say that some of those differences really matter. So there's only less than 1% of all the possible differences are actually different. But one of those differences is whether you have sickle cell, and whether you have one letter or one nucleotide versus another somewhere on your genome. That can really matter. That changes your life. Okay? I don't want to understate that there's just no difference, because there are many differences. So what you do, though, is the what about here. And when you do the what about here millions of times, you have millions of statistical results that come in to ask whether at this location is there a difference in your height, and at this versus this location, where this is 10 million times. And then you're going to present, like, did I find anything? Is there anything there? And so that's called a Manhattan plot, which is to say you're looking for tall buildings in a Manhattan plot. Tall buildings mean there might be a signal in that area of the genome. This is chromosome 1. This is in every test that you ran in chromosome 1. Here's chromosome 2. At every test you ran in chromosome 2. And you're going to draw a line to say that hits above that line means there might be something there. Okay? And so that's step 1. And you're going to have millions of those potential somethings. And then step 2 is I'm going to summarize all the information on my genome or Doug's genome, and going to provide an index of how much risk that I have or Doug has for, say, having a heart attack or being tall versus short. So let me fix ideas. I have a couple graphs I think that would be helpful. So there is an outcome where when you run this statistical analysis, you see there's nothing except for one place. So this is where if you run a genome-wide analysis here, you say, like, I found something, and there's nothing anywhere else in the genome. So this is like sickle cell. This outcome happens to be a report of whether you can smell in urine whether someone has recently had asparagus. That is a genetic outcome, meaning that some people, if you have a certain letter on your genome, you do not smell that. And it's not just somewhere in the genome, it's right there. That one tower on chromosome 1, that's where it is. So that's a simple, you did all these what about here, and there's nothing except right there. Okay, so that's simple. This is the sickle cell case. And most everything we care about does not look like this. So let me engage in that point, which is to say, let's say we care about different food allergies. Now you see some more complicated outcomes, right? There's not one peak. This is only food allergy among egg, milk, and peanut. You see there's definitely something here, but you also see some other peaks. And when you break food allergy into different places, you see that peanut allergies and egg allergies might have this common chromosome 5 location. But over here, cow's milk allergy, it looks like there's something on chromosome 1. Meaning you're doing all these differences. What about here? And you're finding a richness that's across the genome. There's not a single place that tells you what you're going to have a cow's milk allergy. But there's some strong signals, like this one. I mean, there's probably something there, and it's probably something that really matters. But it's not going to be definitive that if you have that something there, you're definitely going to have cow's milk allergy. There's some across the genome, there's different places that seem to matter. Okay, so that's what a genome-wide association study is doing. In this type of analysis, though, you don't have to stop at health outcomes. So that's where I think I'm going to shift to get you thinking about some policy, because there's going to be some policy relevance here. But some of the quote-unquote real policy relevance is first what happens to these scores. So this is so each of these. If you submit your DNA to your clinician or your 23andMe, either one, they will do this analysis where they'll look across the genome and depending on what your genetic signatures are, they'll add up all these different effects across the whole genome and give you a single score. It's like a credit score. And these scores have a bell-shaped distribution where some people have very high risk and some people have very low risk, and a lot of people have very moderate risk for being tall or being short, for having a cardiovascular risk. But in the clinic, this is now being integrated into a physician visit, which is to say, they ask you about your diet and how you're feeling and so on, and they could also pull up a score that says, what's your risk of not just cardiovascular outcomes, but really most anything. Most anything that has a genetic basis you have a score for. So that's how genetics, this is one way genetics now is entering the clinic on this genome-wide scale. But everything I just described can be done for any outcome. So let me pursue that for just a minute, which is to say, 2 years ago, there was a Manhattan plot for how far in school did you go. So, and everything I just said is going to be what's going on here, which is to say, 2 years ago, they found 74 locations, individual tall buildings in the genome that predicted whether 300,000 people went to school longer versus shorter, went to college or didn't go to college. And so this is describing a potential, it's very complex trait. I think there's probably not one chromosome that doesn't have some potential towers on it. And just like the cardiovascular risk I just described that your clinician can talk with you about, this information you can have. You can know your genetic risk for going to college. And it's getting more precise. The other area that's so interesting here is that what I just showed you 2 years ago, 74 places in the genome that they could point to say, if you have a variant here on your genome, then you're going to go to school longer versus if you have the different variant, you're going to go shorter. So 2 years ago, there were 74 locations that were pinpointed. This summer, 2 years now, where do I have? Oh, right, I missed it. Over 1,200 locations. So 2 years ago it was 74 locations, now it's 1,200. What you're seeing is, and now there are there's over 1.1 million people represented in this graph, whereas back here there were 300,000. And what this is doing, though, is showing one, again, complicated genetic architecture of how far in school you go, where so there's no chromosomes that seem to be unrelated, and there's many, many locations. But what this is also doing is providing the ability, not for your clinician necessarily, but for 23andMe or any other organization outside the clinic to provide you with your score, your credit score for schooling. And you can do, so you can send your DNA to 23andMe, and they'll send it right back to you. You can upload it to any one of, so this is a not-for-profit organization at Columbia and NYU. These are scientists who are doing these genome-wide association studies. And they'll send back your prediction for years of schooling. They'll send you back a prediction for IQ. And this is becoming, and the thing about this is that this is now becoming more accurate than any single measure about a person that you can know. It's not more accurate than everything about a person that you know, but if you line this measure up with any other measure, this is just as accurate as anything else. Now,
what about to go to school?
well, that's a good question. Yeah, this is you're describing one way of using this data. So there are many policy questions here, and this is brand new. Like what I just showed you is this summer is coming out with 1,300 lead areas. The first genetic analysis of education was only a few years ago. So this type of analysis a couple years ago was not very predictive at all. Now it's in the running with the single. So what do you think is the single best predictor of a child's years of schooling? So I heard it, but it's even more precise than parents. It's mother's years of schooling. So mother's years of schooling explains about 15% or more of the variation in the population in children's years of schooling. The horse race I'm doing here is against one measure. not knowing everything about the child, like the income of the family and how many siblings they have, and not just knowing one thing about the child, how much prediction do you have. So mother schooling is if you only know one thing, and that makes sense. That's basically what your doctor asks when they're asking, like, what's your family history of whatever. They're getting that measure. So what the family history of years of schooling is the single best measure, and mom's is the best in the United States. This now is in competition with mom. You don't need to know mom's years of schooling anymore. You can go right to the genomes of the child and do the prediction and get just as accurate. Yeah.
Can you tell us for this summer what the R square?
That is what I'm telling you. It's in the 15% range, which is where it gets competition with mom's years of schooling.
Jason, you submitted.
So a couple years ago, I did submit my DNA to 23andMe. So maybe during I guess we're actually close to the Q&A now. I can describe a little bit about the differences in what you get in 23andMe and Ancestry DNA if you'd like. But 23andMe, for $100 or for $200 or so, they won't send you schooling. So they're barred. So 23andMe got in trouble a few years ago, maybe more than that now, because they basically they collected your DNA and sent you back a bunch of junk. And both bunch and junk are both important. They sent you a lot of information about your likelihood of, say, a heart attack, and not only did they send you a lot, meaning the number of traits that they tried to predict for you was many. So that's bunch. Junk, all of them were basically bad predictions. So they were barred by the Food and Drug Administration and the FTC to say all you can do for now is Ancestry. So they did Ancestry for a while, but now they're back. They can now send, partly for right reasons, which is their data set now is over 5 million people. They can create these genome-wide association studies in their data and produce very accurate predictions on many outcomes. So now they'll give you a set of dozens of traits, and then you'll decide, and you can tell them whether you want to know your carrier status for Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, breast cancer is new. So that it's much more. It's more driven both from the regulators who say this is a list of things that are accurate enough that you can actually send out to the public, whereas before it was just the Wild West. They can send you your wine preference or whatever else, and it was just a bunch of junk. But now it's not junk in the sense of it's predictive now, and now it's up to you to tell 23andMe what you want, because you can say, I do not want to know Parkinson's, I do not want to know Alzheimer's, and so on. But going back to what I said a few minutes ago, you can ask them to send you your DNA back to you, and then it's up to you. This is both your interactions with 23andMe is totally outside the clinic. There's no MD in charge here. It's you providing money and they sending you back your genetic code. Once you have your genetic code, you can come to a place like this or many other places that will charge you money. This place is free and can send you whatever. Education, IQ is here, but it could be any kind of health outcome. A company could take the 23andMe data, or you can send it directly to them and they can provide whatever you want. So this is where maybe some of the policy questions are about what we want to have in that interaction that is all outside the clinic, and how we want the government to regulate those type of outside the clinic activities.
And then also, I'm just wondering how much emotions also if you have a self-fulfilling prophecy here, do you know what I mean? Do they test that, because we all have emotions and we all know that emotions also.
So they can't do everything.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was basically what's the scope of what they're going to test, and in particular the question was what sort of emotional outcomes might be tested. And that's going to be what 23andMe asks their customers to provide to them. So now there's many hundreds of survey questions that the 23andMe customers will provide, and that is serving as the backbone to these type of predictions that are now available, not just schooling or IQ, but whether you're a night owl or a morning person, or like how many cups of coffee do you drink every day, what's your tolerance to certain medications. They have a customer base of 5 million people now, so they can very quickly have a data set to do this type of genome-wide association studies on any sort of outcome of interest. So the Big Five personality is close to what you're describing, but not exactly. Like there's clear genetic scores for each of the 5 traits for personality. To the extent you want those, yes, you can get those easily. That's like in the ballpark of IQ. So, but let me step back to the policy question again. I want to hammer in. I think one policy question, which is this information, the way I see it different than the typical ways we discriminate among each other is moving from group-based, which group you could think of as sex or race or sexual orientation or age-based orientation discrimination, meaning like if you're this old, you don't get this, or if you're this young, you don't get this. That's a group. Here it can be personalized, which is if you have a genetic IQ score of above this, you get this, and if you don't, you don't. That's where it can be personalized. So just 3 examples, I won't go into many detail, but just to get you thinking. The only areas in our life right now that are off limits are through the GINA law from George W. Bush signed in his last year in office, which is that your health insurer and your employer cannot discriminate against you based on your genotype, based on your genetics. Everyone else can. Those 2 areas in your life cannot. Now, this was only last year where one of the repeal and replace efforts was going to gut GINA, was going to say, yes, your employer and your health insurer can discriminate against you. And I want to tell you how narrow this is. Life insurers can discriminate against you based on your genotype because they're not health insurers and they're not your employers. Schools can, they're not barred, discriminate against you, or for you for that matter. A school could only let in people with high genetic IQ. No, this is the only thing we have, and it's a limiting case. The other thing I want to describe is how this, I say the future, it's really the present, but it's going to be more, it's going to be important, it's important now, and it'll grow in importance to say, what else might we want these scores to predict? And the hint here is that the DNA that you have now, the 3 billion letters in your code in every one of your cells is the same, almost the same, with a little asterisk I can come back to when you were an embryo. And it's going to be the same when you die. You have the same genetics the whole time. And the implication, your whole life, from an embryo, the implication there is that the education score, the IQ score that I'm describing on adults that is being predicted is the same prediction you would make on a fetus. So, what do we want to allow versus not allow in the genetic predictions of a fetus? Or a young child for that matter. It's the same DNA you would have in the heel prick when the baby's born, or when the baby's still in utero, or when they're 5, or when they're 20, or when they're 70. The same DNA. So it's the same prediction. What do we want to be off limits? And some of these are incredibly, like sex and eye color and so on, those are incredibly easy and precise to know. What do we want for parents or potential parents to know? You might think facial features, like that's a sci-fi in 20 years. No, that was like last year. This is a paper from February of 17 predicting faces of people only based on DNA. You have the real picture on one row and the picture generated from a computer only based on their DNA in another row. And again, the point is that this is the prediction you can make not just for when you're 20 or 30 years old. This is the prediction you can make as a fetus. Okay, good. Now we're to the policy question.
Well, you guys make a point in the book, too, about some red flags about going into being 23. The fact is they could be hacked.
So, this is very much in this ballpark of what do we want regulators to regulate. Right now, it's health insurers cannot, hacked or non-hacked, cannot use your DNA against you in the form of giving you a higher premium on your health insurance or not allowing you to enroll, taking you off the rolls. An employer cannot, there's a law against, I should say, them taking your DNA and saying, oh, you have high risk of depression, I don't want you to be employed here. They cannot do that. Everywhere else in your life does not have that bar. So there's this question of both thinking about policies to what areas of our life are we comfortable with these type of predictions being used for us or against us, is in both directions. People who do not have Parkinson's risk, Alzheimer's risk, and so on, those could be favored from the employer's perspective. Certainly health insurers would want those people more than people who are carriers for breast cancer and Alzheimer's and so on. Like there's a lot of clarity here of who wants to insure these people, to people with this risk or not. So where do we want to draw lines is one question. And then the second one, which is what Doug brought up, is we should plan for, we're already 10 years behind planning for this probably, plan for 23andMe getting hacked. In all those 5 million customers' DNA being released to the public. You recall just last year or more when the credit card agency was hacked, 146 million or whatever people's credit scores were hacked, released to the public. And there's a difference between your credit score and your DNA. There's a couple differences. One is that your credit score is terrible that someone would know your name and your social security number and some of your purchasing history and where you live. Most all those facts about you are potentially changeable if you tried hard enough, and most of those facts aren't very predictive of your health. Your DNA is opposite. It's not changeable. Once it's released, people know that about you forever. There's no changing it, and it is predictive of outcomes that you probably care about. So that's how it's worse than the hack from the credit card companies. And 23andMe has 5 million people. Ancestry DNA has 7 million people. Our criminal justice system writ large in the country have over 12 million people who have biological samples collected for different crimes. Any of those systems could be hacked, and actually this is a segue to an upside of criminal justice, which is this type of prediction has solved murder cases. People who have only, someone who's been murdered and only their arm was recovered. This happened in New York City a couple months ago. They predicted their face based on their DNA in the cells of their arm and figured out who it was and found the killer.
California.
Right, and there's been at least 8 cases. So what Doug's describing is that these large data sets, this is going back to the very beginning when you're marrying your second cousins, which is to say that there's information, even if you're not in the data set, and this is this question that you're all interested in, I'm sure, about whether you should send your DNA to 23andMe, and one point that you might not have thought about is how you're making a decision for your whole family when you do that, especially your biological family. When you do that, and this is going back to the California case where the serial killer was caught, not because the serial killer was in the DNA data set, because a third cousin was in the DNA data set, right? So the DNA from the crime scene can be linked to a third cousin, and then figure out, well, who are the third cousins of this person, or who are the relatives of this person, and roll back of who the killer is. And there's been at least 8 cases now where it's second, third, fourth cousins in a DNA data set where a serial killer or a murderer has been. So that's you can imagine that's a potential upside, but there's immense privacy concerns here. When you're contributing your DNA, you're contributing your parents' DNA, your siblings' DNA, your children's DNA, all at the same time to a company that will likely be hacked. So thinking about then going back to what protections do we want in place for what areas of our lives do we want the benefit or the punishment of discrimination. Health insurers and employers right now are off the table, sort of. Health insurers and employers, one of the last, the slide I just showed was from March 2017, And that was an effort of the repeal and replace of Obamacare that gutted GINA. But there's another effort on the table now of let's get rid of employers out of this picture. Employers would love to know, and they're going to call them wellness programs, would love to know how to better help employees live well and have low health care costs. One way to do that is to get all their DNA and make predictions based on who is likely to have depression, who's likely to have all sorts of health conditions. And the upside would be maybe target those people, these particular people with interventions. The downside is maybe fire those people because you don't want them on your healthcare rolls. You had a question a little bit earlier.
Predictions.
Yes.
That a lot of environmental work, your genes will be expressed differently depending upon the environment. And so do they tell you, it's predicted, but do they give you an idea of what causes something to express?
No, that's really an important point. In almost all the cases, there's a few exceptions. So for Alzheimer's, there's a few really important genetic variants that if you're a carrier of ApoE, a particular variant, your lifetime risk of Alzheimer's is 90+%. It's not 100, so it's not completely determined, but it puts you at great risk. But there's very few cases where having this one variant is definitive. So there's a set of genetic conditions where that is true, but for almost everything else, you should think of this as not a statement of what's causing anything, BMI or height, body mass index or height or weight or anything, but what's predictive of. And that's the predictive of point is, I think, gets you thinking about, well, what policies do we have that rely only on predictive of rather than is cause of? So you could think about college admissions. College admissions are SAT scores and an essay and like a reviewer rating. Those aren't causal statements that having a high SAT score does something. It's a predictive statement, right? And you could do away, this is your point earlier, do the SAT test relatively soon because these tests are going to be better, especially in combination. It's not just IQ, but there's going to be predictions for any sort of, you're describing emotional, other socio-emotional behaviors, psychological traits, grit, the ability to persist. All those there will be some predictive power based on genetics. And right now colleges don't, they don't do it, but there's nothing that bars them from doing it now. High schools either. Yes.
I'm not trying to be word finding black women, for example, had more birth defects regardless of social status.
Yeah.
And presupposing from that there was some kind of wounding factor in American culture. What he said was there's a wounding factor in American culture depressing black achievement.
Right. So let me define a term. Yeah, that's right. So let me define a term, which is epigenetics, which is really important. It's actually related to your point too, which is to say, are these causal or predictive? So epigenetics is how the environment takes these letters that we have in these nucleotides in our DNA and turns them off, turns them off, up, turns them down, turns them on. So that's a huge part of the story, right? What's your diet, what your diet is, how much stress you have, external stress you have, and so on, really matters for the expression of your DNA. But it's still true that this DNA that is being used to predict IQ and so on these measures are what you were as an embryo. They're what you are your whole life, regardless of the environment turning on or turning up. So both of them, this is basically going back to the very beginning. It's not nature versus nurture. It's nature and nurture. It's nature interplaying with nurture. And I'm just reporting back on one part of that, which is to say, you could think of it as mostly a nature part, but it has this interplay with policy, which is taking our DNA nucleotides and running them through the statistical analysis to make predictions and then making policy based on that is part of what is happening now. And the question is, in what areas do we want that policy? These policies are not telling you why black versus white women have differential birth defects, anything like that. Those are interesting and important questions. This is a emerging and use of DNA that I think will only be expanded and be expanded rapidly. I think that's the point. And the other point, like reflecting back on the book, is how far behind the curve we are on thinking about what policies we want in what areas of life we want these scores to be used or not used. Where else besides health insurers and employers do we want to say absolutely we will not use these? So as an example, going back to the spatial and what you want from your baby, there is no regulation. So think about an IVF clinic, which is to say there's embryos produced, and among the embryos produced, one is selected or two are selected. Right now, basically, you screen for genetic conditions and move those aside, and then by chance take some embryos and implant them. There's no law against looking into the embryos a little bit more. In particular, creating all these scores on every embryo and selecting the one you want. Selecting what face you want of the embryos. Selecting which one that has the highest IQ, predicted IQ. Which one's going to be the tallest predicted. So all of that is what's coming. It's already here in China. They're way ahead of us in not just thinking about it, but promoting it. And right now, we're just in the Wild West in the sense that there's no law against or for doing this in any IVF clinic. Right now, what is the constraint is just clinical capacity and the interactions between clients and clinics and what you want and what the doctors are willing to do. But you could very easily take small samples of DNA from, there's a name for it, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So here's a little picture of it. You have an embryo. In the very first few days, you take one of the cells. This cell has the identical DNA of all the other cells in this embryo, and you do whatever genetic analysis you want on it. So right now, what is done, of course, is you screen for genetic conditions, and any embryos that have these genetic conditions, you might decide not to implant. But the same technology, meaning I'm taking one cell, I'm getting the DNA, and then I'm doing something with it, that technology could be used to do everything. Education, IQ, height, hair color, skin color, anything on the list you can imagine, big 5 personality traits, all of those could be predicted based on DNA and therefore selected of the parents. And again, the point is just what policy do we want?
I found it to be a nightmare, but it was, you had this couple, hypothetically down the road in the future, they're with the doctor or they're with the clinic or whatever, and they're literally doing this, what you're talking about. And I mean, there's risk beyond just it being kind of hard to get your head around, but one gene can affect another.
Our main error here in the book, I think we said that was going to happen in 2117 or something. Way, we wrote that little anecdote, which is to say, it's a scene where a couple goes in and does this, basically, where they're going to choose among 4 or 6 embryos, and let's say they want a boy versus a girl, so that's easy, and we want no genetic conditions, that's fine. And then the question for the couple is, you want this embryo that's going to have high IQ, but will likely have, say, I don't remember, it's ADHD or schizophrenia, something. You want this one or the other one? And that, I think the main problem that we face now, like in retrospect, when we wrote this a few years ago, this little anecdote, this little sci-fi story, is that we put it in the future, like 100-something years, which is way too far. It should be like in the past almost. It should be in China today. And the number of embryos being like 2. There's just no reason for that. The selection can be over many, many embryos, and the diagnosis is not just on genetic disorders. It would be on anything you care, anything that has a genetic basis that 23andMe and other companies are creating these genetic predictions for. They're not going to. None of these are going to be 100% accurate. The question is, do we want parents, and do parents want to be making those choices?
What would you hope happens in terms of regulation, or how we rein this in, or should we? I mean, what's your hope?
That's a complicated question, of course, but the things that come to mind, because on one hand you want to go right to the obvious, which is don't do any of this. But what stops me from making it a quick answer, which is don't do it, is the knowledge that any law we have in the U.S. is only for the U.S., and what the implications are of that fact. That even if we were very quick and clear about, no, you cannot do this, period, then there would be this extra bit, this shift, which is to say, well, what about Canada? China, like, there's already the answer for China is yes, you can do this in China. What countries would go one way versus the other, and what are the implications of this? And the other issue that's related about the regulation, depending on which way it goes, is who has access to any of these technologies. What's covered through insurance? We're one of the few countries that has a very fragmented health insurance system, so that it could be that it's only covered if you have like gold-plated insurance, but if you have Medicaid, you know it's a luck of the draw. So these are really important questions that we should have been probably discussing like 10 years ago, and we need to now. You've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, you can think of a lot of nightmare scenarios where you have physically strong, low IQ, potential psychopaths that are being trained, for some malevolent force. And I mean, the abuse of this is just huge. The possibility for it is, and the unintended consequences. Even though you could have 90% predictability,
Right.
that 10%, where's human dignity?
Yeah. It's a great question, and this really flags what the initial point of the Chinese interest in this was, which is 10 years ago, they recruited 2,000, which, in hindsight was way too few to do this type, but, this is over 10 years ago, 2,000 people with something like over 180 IQs in China, and they were wanting to make really intelligent babies by this selection. But the technology is exactly what you said. What stops this? One would be regulation, and the other one is what many of you have brought up, which is this is not 100% predictive. It's not like you can just say, well, this embryo definitely is going to be 6'5", an IQ of 70. Right? This is a prediction that has some accuracy, but nowhere near 100%. So that's going to be a constraint. But regardless of that minutia, it's the question of where and in what instances in our life, especially for our children and grandchildren's lives, we're stuck with what we have mostly. Because if we had another half an hour, we could go into gene editing, which is to say we're not stuck with what we have. But that's for another day, I think. Let me go to this first.
At this point, you talked about probability and information science. Jumped out of Pandora's box for to what extent are those morality and ethics engaging this issue from those positions which can add a different tone of wisdom to the choices that are made by folks facing it?
It probably wouldn't surprise you that these are two different groups. Geneticists are looking for discoveries, and they're doing their job, which is to say, let's try to cure disease. Let's try to find somewhere in the genome that really matters for condition X that really hurts people. But in that lane, they're also making a lot of discoveries on schooling and IQ and so on. So, I mean, as you would expect, the lanes aren't converging on, let's think about the social implications and the policy implications for this. This is maybe a little bit more our job than thinking that geneticists will have the answer for the policy implications of some of this work. Would be the short-ish answer of that. So, no, there is not a body that's thinking very much about this. Where there is thought, I think, not so much on genetic prediction, but on gene editing. Who we want to be able to gene edit, meaning humans, yes, no. The answer there is yes. Embryos, yes, no. Now the answer is yes. And then plants, yes. Animals, yes. There's a lot of yeses now that were mostly no's in just a few years ago. Where there's a current no, that might turn into a yes on gene editing is the distinction between gene editing for therapeutic purposes, which means that, say, you take someone with Huntington's disease and you try to edit their genes to get rid of that mutation for a live human. That's therapeutic, versus enhancements, which are adding mutations into the human genome that aren't there now, maybe, to grow your taller person or to enhance in some other way. That's what's currently off the table in general and not federally funded. Everything else, plants, animals, and editing for therapeutic purposes is on the table and fundable. In the back.
Dealing, on the one hand, with ensuring validity of their data sets.
Yeah.
You said that 23andMe uses surveys. How, I mean, what kind of validation is of that? And the other is, how are they dealing with the biases that are inherent in big data analyses where, well, look, people with a set of characteristics being white are incredibly wealthy. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
Whereas there are pan-cultural factors that are separate from the genetics that are creating that.
I think the short answer to your question is that, by and large, geneticists at 23andMe and at Wisconsin and at research institutions are trying their best to acknowledge what you're describing, which is to say, how do I know that I have a genetic variant here that causally has something in a pathway that I care about for Alzheimer's versus is just noise or is just signaling ancestry? Those are deep questions but those are not questions that are off the radar. Those are active areas of pursuit. And maybe to throw in another huge problem now, if you haven't heard enough. If you had to guess, of every genetic discovery and all of these genetic predictions, what proportion of the data, of the people in the data, are people of European ancestry? You should think of 90% or more. So there's another lane of thought of who's being left out. Is everyone without European ancestry is the short answer there. And what implications are those going to have in the clinic? This is part of your beginning, like what's the clinic going to do? Well, the clinic, you might hear reflections or a similarity here of the fact that many medical trials were done only on men, and the results were just moved over to women. That's a deep history in the medical field. So there's that now in genetics, which is that there's all these analyses and predictions that are only and purposely done only on people of European ancestry that are then the question is, well, what do you do with those, say in the clinic, when you have your genetic prediction that's only for white people where you have someone who's not white? And so that's the question. There's not an answer to that right now. I would just stack that up on all the other questions. But your point, though, I think is something that people really, it's not off their radar. Yeah.
Record ancestry has.
Well,
okay, it's like a credit card. I want to cancel that credit card.
So there's a question here. So on one side, there's a bright side where European Union has recently had a set of regulations you might have seen in your inbox, like everyone that you're subscribed to is like, hey, remember us? And you've got privacy things to think about. So someone in Europe, a European Union citizen now, no one else I think, but can go to ancestry.dna.com and say, take me out. And there's some legal apparatus that they will be taken out. So that's a policy that U.S. could do too. We don't have something like that. But there's a secondary question about, which is related to the question like, can you ever erase something that's on the internet? I don't think so.
Folks, let's do a couple more questions. We want to let Jason Stein have a chance to sign some books. I know he'll be happy to chat some more as well, but maybe two more?
I'm assuming that this is based on autosomal data. Is there a parallel going on with like the Y only looking at boys and education
of sons?
Very little, very little sex chromosome analysis. Well, I guess I mean very little as a proportion of all genome-wide association studies that I'm describing. It's very little. But it's almost my same reaction here, which is to say it's not for lack of interest. It's really a set of technical problems of what geneticists want are causal genetic variants that matter in general, irrespective of your sex. First order. So in doing that, then you actually, all these analyses don't have the sex chromosome in them because they don't want to attribute differences in autism first and foremost to something on the sex chromosome. So that's my short answer. But the new paper on education is diving in a little bit to the sex chromosome. So GWAS have been going on for 11-ish years. There are 40,000 novel hits in those 11 years. There's one new genome-wide association study produced every day now, every day. That is like next, I think, in line is to start sorting out the conditions that might have X-linked, that might have hits in the sex chromosome. That's a great question. Last question.
I want to know, this information is gotten if you subscribe to 23andMe or Ancestry.
What it means, though, is that you've taken a saliva sample and sent it to them.
Right. But are we safe when we go in our wellness programs, in our jobs, or whatever we're doing? Are we safe from being hacked from our employer saying, I want to know more, just take this?
So here I don't want to be overly scaremongering here, because there's a top-level question of will employers go against your interests? But they're barred from the GINA law that I described earlier says employers cannot do that. So I want to throw a little bit of maybe cold water on that. But I also, there's a real question though of whenever I submit my saliva or blood anywhere, it goes into a health record, right? To the extent that any of those records can be hacked, sure, any information, not just your DNA, but your cholesterol and everything else would be there. The thing about DNA though is it's permanent versus your cholesterol reading or your current weight.
Your 23andMe sample correctly predicted that you don't like cilantro.
Right. You got a couple of things right. So I do. So maybe 60 traits. So I don't. So it says I'm not great with. I don't drink a lot of coffee. Right. They say I'm not bald. They got. So if you give them some credit, there's certainly some accuracy. They got more right than wrong in some sense. But it's really. I think that. It's somewhat fun. I thought it was fun. I did originally a few years ago, partly for Ancestry, and deeply disappointed. I'm just very boring. 80% British Isles and a little bit of Western Europe thrown in there. So totally what my parents said was true. So that was a real letdown. But the more serious question is, you tell 23andMe, do you want to know if you're a Parkinson's carrier and a BRCA, the breast cancer gene carrier and Alzheimer's carrier? Those are serious. And I'll go back to, and I'm making many serious points here, going back to, what you learn from Parkinson's carrier or BRCA, the breast cancer gene carrier, has implications all the way up, up to your parents, down to your kids, over to your siblings. It's a very complicated question, and those are maybe the most complicated because some of those variants really matter. They're highly predictive in those limited cases. But I think it's a case study of what decisions you want to make around that type of information, and then start extending it to other types of information, like whether you like cilantro, which is less important, but also predictive.
Well, it's a fascinating book. Congratulations. We have them for sale up here, folks, and thank you again for coming out.
Sorry about the audio issues.
I can project, I think.
No, no, you were great.
Thank you.
I have one quick question. I wasn't clear, do these tests predict behavior such as propensity for criminal activity, which would help law enforcement track people?
So, if your question is, do they have any predictive power for criminal activity? Yes.
Okay.
Is it very good predicting? No. So,
Okay.
like, yes.
And what about, so behavior in general?
Smoking? Pretty good.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Alcohol? Pretty good.
Okay.
It depends what behavior you're talking about. Yeah.
Okay. And you said.
Like driving fast, not so good.
So you recommend not doing the test?
I did it. I don't regret doing it. I guess, like, as a person, just being clear what you're wanting out of it, I think, is the main thing. Like, I don't regret it.
But you're at risk for someone hacking. You're worried about that. But
And
seeing as
I don't
our
worry about
entire-
that myself, but it's true. You are at risk.
Okay, thank you very much.
What about, analyzing, why are there more Asian kids at Harvard or stuff like that? Are they on the track of that? I mean, a racial difference.
That's right. No,
It's going to be.
The answer is yes. It's not going to be about. Right. It won't be about DNA differences across Asian and Europeans. That's very likely. There'll be other things, culture, whatever, but like the actual DNA differences are not right here.
You don't think they are?
They are for things that you see, like facial features. Those are really different. But for IQ, they're not.
Has that been factually proven?
Well, I mean,
Is that an article of faith? I'm being cynical. Is that an article of faith or is that?
No, I wouldn't say it's an article of faith. I would just say that the things that you can see are clearly genetic. Something as broad as IQ is just not difference enough. In the group.
I'll install you over there.
All right, you're all Okay, great. Okay.
I mean, how far in school you go? Years of school. What are you asking? Thank you.
I did hang on just 1 second.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's not 100%. It's not 100% prediction. Not at all. It's 20%. Would you like a name? One of your names in here, or just my name? Judy and Gary.
You sure can. So do you clear your job?
I think that if you get something like from 23 and can you then take that information and I've got this, so I'm going to change my ways to.
That's where the clinic. This is yours,
Yeah.
right? That's where you going to the clinic. There's a possibility. I mean, like something like smoking, alcohol, caffeine, sleep. There's possibilities here. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Hi.
Changing the existing gene within your body.
So gene editing, it's hard for an adult because the DNA exists in every one of your cells. So for most conditions, that means you'd have to edit 1 trillion cells or whatever.
That's where you have to do it. That's the level you have to do it.
If you're already an adult, yes. If you're an embryo, no. If you're an embryo, you can go in and edit the 1 cell or the 2 cells, and then all the cells will
In other words,
replicate.
if I've got Parkinson's, they could go in there as an adult and change that or not.
It depends. So it depends on the condition. So something like some eye conditions, those have been editable because you're only changing you're only changing DNA around the eye. So it depends how complex the outcome, the trait or the outcome is. So something like your vision, if you can edit the eye, then it seems to work okay. But something like IQ, you'd have to go and edit your brain cells. It seems like it's going to happen soon.
I'm particularly interested in Parkinson's.
So I don't know enough about how, if there's a specific area in the body that could be targeted with these edited cells or not. That's the key. Whether there's one relatively small area. So they basically would take your cells, edit them, and send them back into your body. That look just like yours, but there's like a difference, a couple differences.
So I would wake up the next day.
Well,
Thank you.
Not quite. I mean, really, so if it was some like eye condition, that's close. It almost would be the next day. But for something that's more complex and has more widespread features, then it's harder to do that.
So if someone wanted to pursue that, where would they go?
I think it'd be a clinical trial. I think you'd find a clinical trial who's currently editing humans for Parkinson's, which is probably like on the short list of what's being done right now. And I mean, the other thing is the passing down to children and grandchildren that, though, it opens possibilities for editing of next generations before they develop symptoms, for example.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
I didn't even know that they had done. I knew that they were doing
Thank you very much for engaging us here, being able to explain it to lay audiences and not so lay audiences. And for taking the time to do a book with someone who started out from a list and a collegial adversarial position.
That's just for fun.
Just sticking it out. That's pretty good.
Would you like your names in or just my name in it?
My name would be great.
Okay, can you spell?
I also didn't. I also
L.A. You said Elaine or?
It was a place that was doesn't surprise me, but that was in there.
That was going to be my question, and then all of a sudden it was, because it's all this.
I don't remember hearing any reporting of that.
Right.
We're monitoring what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, watchdog.
I'm not against it. I don't regret my decision, but it's useful to think about.
Well, even that was my first.
No, that'd be too on the nose.
That would be way too long. I would know. Yeah.
Those are reasonable. Those are reasonable choices.
So I really appreciate it.
We appreciate having you.
Yeah. So when things come up, just let us know.
High probability.
Let us know. I mean, we wouldn't have known about this.
But low probability just makes for nagging suspicion. Don't need that either.
Probability is a probability.
Yes, that's true. Thanks very much for coming. Yeah, thanks very much. Hi. Hello.
Yeah.
Would you like your name in here?
First row.
My name's Angela.
Silver.
Angela. Regular?
Vaccine. You know how to drive addiction? Good.
You don't have to worry.
All right. I'm just saying. It's the top button. It's my only key.
I predict I will read this book before the end of the year. No, I will. I have a huge pile by 2 book clubs.
Oh, yeah.
I do too.
No, this area really fascinates me. This and AI.
This,
Blowing my mind.
I agree with you. I think this AI and climate change are. So you're sick of that. So you're.
Yeah, kind of. This is like fascinating me. I know. I'm ready to change it. Yeah. See all the rain today? No.
I know it's in my basement.
Supposed to get rain. It's supposed to get rain in this area. Supposedly, there's pictures of this area is supposed to get rain here.
It's all bad news. Thank you.
I know.
It's like Wales, but warmer.
Just Jim.
Sure.
Thanks again for doing this.
No problem.
I was really excited when, like I said in the introduction, we have this series that we've done here at the library for the last 3 years where we invite professors, mostly from UW, to talk about their research or, just to give their favorite lecture. And this is kind of a bonus episode of that.
I'm guessing Richie Davison did mindfulness.
Yeah, he
was
talked
it like
about
that lecture or was it something?
It was. He talked about the his book, the recent book that he co-authored with the emotional intelligence guy. I can't remember his name.
Daniel Goleman.
Goleman, yeah. Goldman, yeah, he talked about the book Altered Traits. Yeah, that was good. We have another 3 lectures coming up. We have John Hawks, the
he's a
ecologist.
He's great.
We're going to have him at the Middleton Performing Arts Center in October in conjunction with the Wisconsin Science Festival. So.
Great. Hi there.
Where is that lecture gonna get published?
That's gonna be, which one?
How the DNA
The Hawks, I don't know if we're gonna be able to videotape it or not.
Yeah.
Oh, where is it gonna be?
Yeah.
The notice of
So it depends if you believe it predicts IQ and
Do you get our
cognition.
emails?
Yeah, I know, I kind of thought everybody was
Okay, so that means you'll get, if you received an email notice.
Well, you have to be convinced that it's possible that DNA predicts some part of IQ differences between people, I think.
You can sign up as adults.
Start with that, yes, please.
Sorry you admitted the good news.
To make sure.
Good news is we're 98% rat.
Just like on our website.
99% all the same humans and
Otherwise,
90% fish.
We'll always have
70% E. coli. Sometime we're all going to realize that with the skin off, pretty much everyone is the
For the
same.
series that you're talking about.
And that might take a couple of hundred
Hawks
years.
lecture, that's the final lecture.
That's true.
in that
I agree with
series
all that.
for the year.
Yeah.
We have all of those.
I did the one fact that we're all 99.5% plus.
Right.
But the rest of it I didn't do.
But the
right.
idea that they're really all the same.
Yeah.
We're all really the same. There's a lot of similarities,
actually
much
2
more
other
similarities than
lectures
differences.
in that series.
And you were on the
Absolutely.
different side for most of the time.
Yep.
Next one is, what was I going to say? I want to know, you've made a lot of comments about 23andMe, which I'm fond of.
He was part of the
Only
team
because that's where I
that
sent my DNA. I didn't send
Well,
it
I'm
to
with you.
Ancestry.
My question is, what good is Ancestry? Because people ask me, which is the better thing?
I'll tell you, I know the answer, I know an answer to this, which is that Ancestry DNA currently has more people, which is good for prediction and everything else. The feature that Ancestry has that's different is that they combine the DNA with the genealogy that they have. So,
They're better on a genealogy.
but they're not making them separate, they're putting them together, so that just really enhances the power. So one thing that they both do is that they'll send you a list of people you're related to. Have you gotten this feature yet? In 23andMe, they'll send you a list.
Yeah, they sent me, they've actually found one of my second cousins.
There you go. So 23andMe just has a fewer people and does not have the
I didn't really trust them when they sent me this stuff.
Ready to pick up on
And I
Mine
follow them up.
have been
They
accurate.
did find me one good one.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I mean, there are also people that my dad would have said like, yeah, I know that person, so it wasn't news. And Ancestry DNA will give you more in like where your family in the United States has been over time.
Within the United States or
Within the United States. So they'll both do Ancestry in continental Europe and so on.
I looked up one for Eastern Europe. I looked up some papers and I was doing 23andMe for myself to find out. The thing I was looking up Lithuania. Right? In Lithuania, there are 4 ancient tribes.
Okay.
Somebody did in Lithuania did a study to try and find out whether they could find out who came from which of these 4 groups.
Sure.
And the answer is no, they're all European.
So far,
That was as close as they could get.
But that will get better over time
That's just
when
a
they
matter of bigger data,
That's right, and so that's the reason that Ancestry is better right now because there's more people in the data set.
Still not they're big enough to make a big splash.
No, they're very similar. I don't have a strong opinion on those two. They're very similar.
One more point for you.
Yeah, I carried that in.
I
could carry some these packs or lock them up for you.
Do you want me to deface your book, or would you like it?
Thank you again.
You can't give them away if people autograph them. I can't give it to my, if I give it to my kids. No, eventually they all go into the book box, and it's a real shame. I feel bad about that.
Oh well, thanks for coming.
But they do. I mean, I can't keep them. How many books do you have in your home?
It shrinks. Yeah.
What?
Yeah, it shrinks every time we move.
I used to have a home with a library that was as big as a small, maybe.
Yeah.
And I can't.
I know. It's a shame.
I've overwhelmed it so many times. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Hi. The ancestry side of things.
Yeah.
I seem to recall having read some, maybe it's anecdotal, for anecdotes and data, but just where it's like you get 2 different vendors providing the service,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I mean, in Europe, no.
Well, it depends how
so
complicated
what
you
is
are.
the-
So like mine would be the same because I'm not complicated. It's all British Isles and a little bit like French and German. So, but to the extent you have a more complicated lineage, then you're right, because each separate data set just like asking, who are you most similar to in our data set? And they have, and 23andMe is mostly rich white people from the U.S. So like to the extent, you know.
You can't afford $200 for one of these things. You can't
Right.
do it.
Yeah. So to the extent that you're, like, so many reports from people who I know will just come back East Asian. You know, that's not like where mine comes. You know, Irish and so. Because they're doing this exercise of who are you similar to in our data and where are they from. So it's just a matter of how good their data is.
Right.
And it depends where you're from. If you're from Western Europe, then you'll get a pretty accurate prediction. If you're not, then it's so-so.
Dicey and dicey.
Yeah.
Yeah. And again, that gets back to my concern.
Yeah, it's an important concern.
How do you keep this data from reinforcing biases or misreading the predictive correlation that is
So right
underlying.
now the answer is only do all this on European. So there's no comparison. There's not even a comparison. Yeah. That's one way to do it.
Oh, that's scary.
People have always tried to make a good marriage for their kids.
This is so I mean, there are companies now that part of their service is to compare your DNA with your spouse and so on. Yeah.
But what I'm saying, that technology has been around for a long time.
Like matchmaking. But it wasn't, you're right, matchmaking. So the question is this going to be?
Matchmaking has always been there.
That's true.
It's just the technology has
it's
evolved
just
over the
faster,
years.
faster and more expensive.
Yes, this is all true. Yes.
Well,
thanks, Eva. You just want my name or something like on Wisconsin or just my name? Your name is okay. Yeah. Do you want B? No.
No. We always have a very engaged audience, as Jane can attest. But that one was.
That was really good.
There's a lot of meat.
There's a lot to think about. That's
I didn't even realize that 23andMe would do like the BRCA and all that stuff.
BRCA is brand new.
Do you have genetic counselors that talk to people about that, or is it just like, here you go?
You can. So I don't know the answer to that, except I mean, there's a huge. I think that they would put you in touch with someone, probably for a fee, and then there's a very long like FAQ for these. And BRCA is brand new. So Parkinson's and Alzheimer's is 6 months or more old. BRCA, I think, is a month.
Because I remember when I looked at it, probably a year or more ago, I heard that I think it was, I can't remember if it was Ancestry or 23andMe, and they said, find out things about your health. And I thought, really, wow, that could be potentially,
it can be scary.
Devastating.
Yeah.
But then I read about it, and it was all these generic sort of things like, the best diet for you, based on your, whatever. It was like it was like, okay, well then that's not really, I mean, what is it telling you? But you're talking about the things that like.
It's new though. So they were, like I said, I can't date when this happened, but I'm going to say a couple of years ago, they could not tell you anything about your health that was consequential because their data were too bad. And then they got this policy, I don't remember if it's an FTC or an FDA policy, like within the last year or so, and now they have to meet some criteria of like it being a really important illness that has a strong genetic basis, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and breast cancer, meet those. And there have to be, I think, some actionable elements that 23andMe can say that their client might take if they get this genetic. So it's a very short list right now of 3 or 4.
Well, yeah, like something like Huntington's or something.
They don't do Huntington's.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't either. And like you said, you're not involved. It's not just you. My sister calls me up tomorrow and says, "Hey, I got this test, and they say that I'm, so now I'm implicated in that, whether I wanted to know that or not."
You're exactly right. Yes.
My mother actually has a rare autoimmune disease, and she, years ago when she was diagnosed, they were doing a study and they wanted swabs from her relatives and stuff, and she asked me if I would do it, and I thought about it long and hard, but the really like anxious and sort of scared. Part of me said, I said, no, I'm sorry. I mean, if I thought it would help her, I would do it. No, it was just basically
for science, yeah.
So, yes, for science, which is great.
Yeah.
But I rather selfishly, I guess, and I think about that decision quite a bit. Like when we talk about stuff like this, you know, I guess at the time I just said no. You know,
It's your decision.
I don't want to. Not that they would have been able to tell me anything at my risk or anything like that, but.
No. So you would be the control, basically. You're unaffected.
Well, yeah, so far. I mean, yeah, right. I mean, yeah, it's a rare enough disease that they don't know the genetic.
Well, if it's that rare, then it might have taken both your mom and your dad to have provided a risky variant.
Sure, right, I know.
Unlikely to have it.
Thanks, Jim. Jason, thank you.
Thank you. I love this support.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.